At the General Staff Academy, we weren't treated like cadets anymore. And rightly so, every one of us was a commissioned officer with real combat experience. Most had commanded sizable units, and many had distinguished themselves in battle. My quarters looked more like a hotel suite than military housing, and to my surprise, the service wasn't far off either. We dined in a mess hall that rivaled some upscale restaurants, both in design and the professionalism of the staff. The Federation valued its future military elite. Naturally, there was no such thing as curfews or liberty passes here. None of the quaint rules and restrictions from our academy days. You were expected to show up to classes and exams on time. Outside of that, your time was your own, unless a crisis hit. Of course, the induction ceremony. I could feel the eyes on me. No one else here wore a rank lower than captain. I hadn't seen a single second lieutenant, and I'd already counted more than a dozen lieutenant colonels before giving up. They were everywhere. General O'Sullivan's speech didn't leave much of an impression. The old Irishman had clearly crossed the line from soldier to bureaucrat a long time ago. I already knew what awaited us within these walls, so I only listened with half an ear. After the ceremony, the entire group moved en masse to our mess hall, which honestly looked more like a high-end restaurant, for the celebratory dinner marking the start of the academic year. I hadn't had the chance to meet anyone yet, so I quietly took a seat at one of the edge tables and waited to see what would happen. It didn't take long. With a mumbled something that probably meant, "Mind if we join you, Lieutenant?" 2 majors and a captain plopped themselves down at my table without ceremony. From the way they acted, it was obvious they knew each other well. What wasn't obvious was why they chose to sit here. There were still plenty of empty tables around. "Good evening, gentlemen." I greeted them first, out of respect for their senior rank. I didn't bother standing or saluting, hardly the place for it. "Evening, Junior Lieutenant," said one of the majors, the one with the most memorable double chin. He looked off. Not drunk. Exactly. There was no smell of alcohol, but I'd have bet he was riding something mild. In the capital, you could buy all sorts of junk. I raised an eyebrow at him and asked, "Major, do we know each other well enough for you to address me so casually?" "Oh, relax, Junior. No need to be stiff," the second major chimed in. He was in better shape, more squared away than his counterpart. "It's a party, after all. Informal setting, gentlemen," I replied coolly, rejecting the familiar tone without escalating. "Do you actually need something from me? If you're just attached to this particular table, I can move, no problem." "Well, Lieutenant," said the captain, a short man who looked a few years younger than the majors, "we were just trying to figure out how someone your age and your rank ends up at the General Staff Academy. We placed a little bet, but we couldn't agree on whose protege you are. You can't be more than 25, and honestly, you look younger than that. But from the look of your patch, you've seen real action. The Golden Star, what was that for?" "Protus 3, I answered flatly. I didn't want to continue the conversation, but I also wasn't trying to start a fight. "Ah, that one," the captain nodded. "Didn't turn out as bad as the strategists feared. Still not bad. What about the Iron Cross?" "That's a soldier's award, not something they hand out to officers every day." "Proxima. Rescue Op Neutral Zone. You're not very talkative, are you, Lieutenant?" The heavy-set major leaned in again. "Don't want to chat with us? What do you think, gentlemen?" I looked around the table. "We've never met. You sat at my table without asking if I minded, started talking to me like we're old drinking buddies, and then began tossing out questions that any reasonable man would call provocative. Ask yourselves, would you enjoy that? Well now, Junior, that's a hell of a tone. You're 3 ranks below us and 10 years younger. Who's supposed to introduce himself first?" "I'd say it's the person who's initiating the conversation," I replied evenly. "And as you already noted, this isn't exactly a formal setting. Just answer the question, who pulled strings to get you in here? And we'll be on our way," the captain said, his voice sharper now. More controlled, but edged with menace. The way he moved, the way his jaw clenched, made it clear he was juiced on something too. "Gentlemen, don't you think your behavior is bordering on inappropriate?" I asked, letting a touch of steel into my voice. "Just answer the question," grunted the major with the binary chin. "Enjoy your evening, officers," I said, standing up. This place has suddenly lost its appeal. I turned and headed for the exit. I could eat in my room if I needed to. And besides, I had better things to do than entertain three chemically enhanced egos playing detective over a dinner table. The heavier major twitched like he was about to follow me, but the captain grabbed his arm and held him back. He spoke just loud enough for me to hear. "Lieutenant, crossing us isn't good for your career. Remember that. You'll learn soon enough how true those words are." I didn't respond. What would be the point? Let them sleep it off. Idiots high on whatever joy juice they'd found to celebrate their new academic life. It would pass. Only it didn't. That I've always believed that fate has a cruel sense of humor, and that belief was quickly confirmed the next day. During our first class on strategic command and operations, I got my first look at the rest of my group. And there they were, the same three smug faces from last night, grinning like they'd won the lottery. I couldn't even muster surprise. What can I say? I must have some kind of gravitational field that pulls trouble straight into my junior lieutenant orbit. "Gentlemen," said Colonel General Swirsky, our instructor, a fit man with a sharp voice and keen eyes that missed nothing. "Today's session is introductory. We'll be examining the last major engagement in which our army and fleet managed to halt the enemy's advance, but at a steep cost. We were ultimately forced to abandon the Temp 112 system." He looked around the room, letting his words settle. "This case study will serve as a foundation for familiarizing you with our training environment, specifically the simulator for large-scale command of ground and naval forces. At the end of the session, each of you will complete an exercise designed to show you the complexity and nuance of directing joint force operations. This won't be graded, and it won't count toward your final assessment. It's simply an opportunity to explore the platform, but we will review your performance." He paused, then added with a faint smile, "You'll each assume the role of one of the actual commanders in the battle for Temp. Once you've completed your simulation, we'll compare your decisions and results to what happened in the real conflict, but we'll get to that later." Then the general told us the truth, the real truth, about what had happened in the Temp and Bridge Star systems. Information that had never made it to the public news feeds, or even into the restricted military briefings meant for frontline officers. In here, at the General Staff Academy, our access clearance was far beyond anything I'd ever encountered, and what we learned was bad, very bad. Those systems had been caught completely off guard by the enemy's massed assault. Not just underdefended, not just unprepared. Orbiting the dim red primary of the Temp 112 binary system, Component A, was a scattered procession of nearly 15 planets of varying sizes. 3 of them had undergone partial terraforming some 30 years ago, and it was on these worlds that the Federation had anchored the key nodes of its defensive infrastructure. 15 years earlier, orbiting fortresses had been constructed around those planets. Since then, they'd been upgraded a few times and were considered formidable enough to repel any sudden planetary assault. For such stations hovered above each of the core worlds. Meanwhile, the fleet stationed in system consisted of 5 battleships, 10 cruisers, 2 carriers, and about 50 destroyers and corvettes, a force deemed flexible and powerful enough to maintain control. The swarm had probed the outskirts of both the Temp and neighboring bridge systems from time to time, testing Federation response. But no serious attack had ever come. Regardless, the 7th Fleet maintained an extensive mesh of mobile surveillance platforms throughout the region and regularly patrolled the outer approaches using several dozen of the most modern corvettes. These were equipped with hyperfield scanners, experimental and expensive systems, still unreliable, but theoretically capable of detecting enemy vessels before they emerged from jump space. During the emergency preparations for the Federation's counteroffensive on Protus 3, numerous reinforcements had to be diverted to bolster the 5th Strike Fleet, and those reinforcements had to come from somewhere. As a result, Temp and Bridge were stripped of many of the very ships responsible for deep space reconnaissance and early threat detection. Subsequent analysis would strongly suggest that the swarm deployed its latest stealth technology in the attack, systems roughly 10 to 15% more effective than anything the Federation had previously encountered. That, combined with the thinning of Federation patrol assets, led to disaster. The swarm fleet entered the Temp system completely undetected. The suddenness of the assault caught the Federation's main force in a state of only moderate combat readiness, and, worse, scattered across the system. That meant the fleet had to engage piecemeal, in fragmented groups, while the swarm was able to generate local superiority, often outnumbering defenders by 10 to 1 in isolated engagements. With a force already double the Federation's in capital ships and carriers, the swarm quickly achieved overwhelming superiority. By the time the battle reached the upper orbits of the main planets, only about one-third of the original 7th Fleet remained intact, and just barely managed to fall back under the protective umbrella of the orbital fortresses that a similar situation unfolded in the bridge system, though there the swarm had committed noticeably fewer forces. Military analysts would later conclude that the assault in that sector had served as a diversion, meant to tie down Federation reinforcements and prevent them from being dispatched to the embattled temp system. Even in its reduced form, however, the attack on Bridge inflicted serious losses and widespread destruction. Meanwhile, in Temp, the remnants of the 7th Fleet clung to the orbits of the core planets and their fortress stations, continuing to resist, even though the outcome was no longer in doubt. Substantial ground forces were stationed on the planets themselves, but there was little they could do to aid their dying comrades in space. Their firepower reached only into low orbit. The anti-orbital missile batteries lay in wait, prepared to open fire the moment the swarm tried to punch a hole in the defenses and begin their descent. That moment came swiftly. The 7th Fleet fought to the last ship, sacrificing everything in a doomed attempt to prevent the enemy from clearing a path to the surface. Once the mobile space forces were gone, the orbital fortresses became little more than heavily armed, semi-static targets. They continued to put up a fierce resistance, but they could no longer stop the landing operations, or, more critically, prevent the swarm fleet from unleashing orbital strikes against the ground forces below. Under such conditions, the planet-based anti-orbital systems were quickly neutralized. The swarm didn't care about the cost, and in the end, the losses they took were not nearly as high as expected. From there, it was only a matter of time. The planetary defenders had no way to counter the enemy's landed troops. The swarm simply bypassed strongholds, circled around pockets of resistance, and erased them from orbit at leisure, such is always the case when one side holds total control of the skies. General Svirsky fell silent, and a heavy stillness settled over the room. Every officer in the audience had seen real combat. Each one could vividly picture themselves in the place of those who had perished, aware, in their final moments, that their deaths would change nothing. After the battle, Svirsky continued at last. The entire course of the engagement was subjected to exhaustive review, both by human analysts and by specialized simulation programs. The failure of our reconnaissance efforts is obvious and undisputed. The enemy fleet's emergence from hyperspace inside the temp system caught us completely unprepared. By all reasonable standards, they should have been detected during their previous drop near the system's edge, or at least just before their final jump. But they weren't. He paused for a beat, then went on. That said, the subsequent actions of the fleet and planetary defense forces have been rated quite highly. Command of the mobile space units fell to Admiral Berkovich, and after his death, to Vice Admiral Stravinsky. According to the simulations, their combat effectiveness reached 82% of the best-case performance scenario. As for the ground forces, they had far less room to maneuver, trapped in a situation that was virtually hopeless from the start. The planetary defenses on the 4th, 5th, and 7th planets were under the command of Lieutenant Generals Sanders, Lewinsky, and Grigoriev, respectively. Their combat efficiency ranged between 70 and 75% of the optimal. In the end, Svirsky concluded, based on every scenario we analyzed, no matter the quality of leadership or decision-making, we would have lost the Temp 112 system. What happened next, I already knew. The 5th Strike Fleet, battered from the battle at Protus 3, had been rushed to reinforce the threatened systems. It arrived first at Bridge. The swarm, however, refused to engage and immediately withdrew, jumping in the direction of Temp. And by the time Admiral Nelson brought his ships into the Temp system, it was clear there was no one left to save. The enemy had seized full control and was already fortifying the system in preparation for further defense. After a quick assessment of the enemy's strength, Nelson contacted command for instructions. The response was prompt. Return to Bridge. Well, gentlemen, General Svirsky continued. That concludes the operational overview. Now we move on to the practical portion of today's session. Please follow me to the strategic simulation training hall. The adjacent room turned out to be a vast chamber. At its center, before rows of seats, stood a large projection screen, currently displaying a rotating 3D logo of the Academy. Lining the walls were gray steel cubes, some sort of equipment, their function not immediately obvious. That, as it turned out, was the main feature of the hall. General Sversky tapped something on his tablet, and the cubes opened like vault doors. "Officers, take your places inside the simulators," he instructed. "All further instructions will be provided once you're inside." The simulator turned out to be a fascinating device. Inside, it felt like a hybrid between a starship's command bridge and a planetary command vehicle. Sversky's briefing quickly brought us up to speed. The table occupying the center of the chamber was essentially a massive command console. It could display real-time 3D tactical maps, communication feeds, unit positions, movement diagrams, loss statistics, and a wealth of other critical data, all tailored to the scenario at hand. Orders could be issued just like in a real combat environment, either by voice or by manipulating unit icons on the tactical display. The simulator automatically generated reports from subordinate commanders and realistically emulated battlefield management. A wall-sized 3D display above the command table showed the evolving battle scenario. Any detail could be isolated or expanded upon with a gesture. In short, the interface was intuitive and easy to grasp. Once everyone had confirmed they were ready to begin, we heard General Sversky's voice once again. "Now, officers, General," Sversky said, "you will all be given the same scenario. It will take you 2 to 3 hours of real time to complete. And I do mean real time, because the simulated battle spanned 3 full days, but we obviously don't have the luxury of spending that long in the simulators. Instead, the intervals between your key decisions and command executions will be accelerated. The simulator uses detailed data and combat statistics gathered from our real engagements with the swarm, thoroughly analyzed by our intelligence divisions. The enemy's tactics are well documented. The swarm rarely deviates from its standard operational patterns, which, fortunately for us, simplifies simulation accuracy. In a moment, each of you will assume the role of Lieutenant General Sanders, commander of the planetary forces on Temp 4. You'll be dropped into the situation as it stood when the swarm fleet first entered the system. Along with command over all planetary troops, you'll also have operational control of 4 orbital fortresses and the remnants of the 7th Fleet, those ships that happened to be in orbit around Temp, for when the swarm's space forces arrived. And, should you need anything from them, the planet's civil administration is under your authority as well. The rest of the battle, beyond your scope of influence, will unfold as it did in reality. Your objective is to inflict maximum damage on the enemy. I hope you can match the results achieved by Lieutenant General Sanders, who died a hero commanding. This defense, stand by, gentlemen. Combat simulation will commence in 30 seconds. The screen in front of me lit up softly and projected a tactical overlay. In the upper right corner, data streams began to scroll, already flashing red with the arrival of swarm units in the system. I scanned the operations map and called up the roster of forces at my disposal. Under my command was an infantry corps, reinforced with 2 battalions of heavy bull K-4 combat mechs. I also had 40 mobile anti-orbital missile launchers and nearly 300 atmospheric fighters and assault aircraft. All of that was on the ground. In orbit, I had 4 space fortresses, and eventually, they'd be joined by a battered battleship, a nearly disabled carrier, a moderately intact cruiser, and about a dozen smaller vessels. From General Sversky's briefing, I remembered that the swarm would force the remnants of the 7th Fleet into low orbit within 6 hours. I was hoping that would be enough time to execute my plan. I stared at the list of forces and felt the weight of their firepower. It was a formidable army. But I also remembered that 80% of Temp 4's planetary defense forces didn't fall in direct combat with the swarm's landing troops. They were annihilated from orbit. The moment, my ground forces were only about 1.5 times smaller than the entire invasion complement the swarm had brought into the system. If I wanted to achieve even a marginally successful outcome, I had to force the enemy to fight on equal terms, or better yet, on mine. Order the orbital fortresses to begin repositioning. I gave my first command in this virtual battle, marking the new coordinates of my most formidable space-based weapons on the tactical display. "They're gonna throw me the hell out," a cheerful voice chimed in the back of my mind. But I shoved it firmly into the mental basement where it belonged. That I pulled up the planetary map and began issuing relocation orders to my ground forces. I finished with a directive to the head of the civilian administration to initiate evacuation toward a sector I designated, even assigning a transport battalion to assist. The entire process took about 10 minutes. Then I triggered the accelerated time mode. The sluggish drift of the orbital fortresses transformed into rapid flight, while the icons of my ground forces and air squadrons darted across the screen like frantic insects. The clock spun wildly. After 2 minutes, I halted the simulation's rush and found myself in an entirely new strategic landscape. Any military analyst observing from outside, my choices would have seemed like utter lunacy, possibly even treason. I was, in effect, handing the planet over to the enemy without a fight. But the outcome had never been in doubt. The swarm was going to take the planet, no matter what. So why burn through my limited space assets in a hopeless effort to stop their landing? I chose another path. The standard deployment of the 4 orbital fortresses placed them at the vertices of a tetrahedron inscribed around the planet, ideal for global coverage and effective when a strong fleet is present to use them as anchor points. But in my case, the fleet was almost non-existent. At such vast separations, the fortresses couldn't meaningfully support one another. A concentrated enemy force could tie up a fortress in direct combat until it lost the ability to control its zone's low orbit, a scenario that had played out in the real battle for Temp. Forward at those powerful, heavily armed platforms had made no decisive difference that I decided to use them together. I selected a relatively small stretch of the planetary surface, one dense with munitions depots, fixed planetary defense systems, and other military infrastructure. I ordered all 4 fortresses to reposition directly above this region in a square formation. I relocated my entire ground corps there, along with all reinforcement units. Into the heart of this defensive zone, I pulled in as much of the civilian population as time allowed. All the arriving Federation ships fell into orbit within the square, reinforcing what was quickly becoming a fortress in its own right. The logic behind this maneuver was simple. If I had a planetary force roughly equivalent in strength to the enemy's, then why waste it trying to prevent a landing? The only meaningful argument for opposing the drop was to protect civilians, and that was a worthy cause, no doubt. But the actual balance of forces rendered that goal untenable. Trying to save everyone meant losing everyone. In my version, there was a chance, however slim, to save at least some. But the real point was this: I didn't want the enemy to be able to strike my forces from orbit. I wanted my ships above my troops. That changed everything. The swarm would find it far more difficult to dislodge a reinforced stronghold like this. And it wasn't just a stronghold, it was a beachhead. Because somewhere out there, beyond the veil of folded space, the 5th Strike Fleet was racing toward us, engines howling and teeth clenched. And when it arrived, it would desperately need a piece of ground still held by Federation troops. The battle had begun at this point. My orders mattered little. Every soldier knew their maneuver, and the fight was unfolding without my direct involvement. I re-engaged the accelerated simulation mode. The ROI deployed their landing forces with lightning speed and, ignoring the civilians still hiding in the evacuation zone, surged forward in an aggressive assault, and got themselves soaked in blood that a storm of heavy fire tore into their lead units, blending their formation with the scorched ground. The orbital fortresses and ships overhead played no small part in the carnage. Then the ROI changed tactics. They pulled back their ground units for regrouping and turned their fleet's attention to our orbital umbrella. That went poorly for them. It's one thing to tie up a lone fortress defended by a few battered ships, quite another to challenge the coordinated salvos of 4 fresh, armored behemoths capable of disabling a battleship in under 10 minutes. That I checked the chronometer. By this time in the actual battle, ROI had already shattered Sanders' core and were finishing off the remaining combat-ready units with orbital strikes. Sure, the surviving troops continued to fight for another 2 days, but it looked more like guerrilla resistance than organized defense. On the 5th and 7th planets, where Federation troop numbers were even lower, resistance was crushed within a day. I fully expected Roy to redirect all those forces toward my foothold, and so they did. The Roy space assets, briefly caught off guard, received reinforcements from the 5th and 7th planets and launched a new offensive, coordinated with a second major ground assault. Their strategy wasn't particularly elegant, but resisting it felt like trying to stop a runaway train with your bare hands. The fortresses and ships barely had time to think about supporting ground forces. There was so much death flying at them that the close-in defense systems, rapid-fire guns, and missile interceptors could barely keep up with the most immediate threats. Some missiles and projectiles still smashed into the thick armor of the fortresses. Occasionally, ships got clipped too. The first to go was the carrier, already badly damaged from the previous engagement. After launching the last few fighters of its depleted air wing, it began slipping out of orbit, first slowly, then with increasing speed, dragged down by the planet's gravity well. The fortresses reported widespread damage. The battleship's guns had gone mostly silent, forcing it to use the bulk of a nearby fortress as cover. The cruiser was still holding its own, but it was obvious its ability to remain in the fight was quickly dwindling. The Roy were taking hits too, serious ones. Their icons blinked out one after another on the tactical projection. After all, for orbital fortresses, standing shoulder to shoulder by cosmic standards could pour out a density of fire that would make even the toughest warship feel like it was burning in hell. Meanwhile, the surface assault was underway. The Roy had redeployed troops from conquered planets and were throwing them at our fortified zone in a full-force offensive. Their numerical advantage was undeniable, but without orbital support, these were not the same shock troops who had torn through Sanders' core with ease. We held the line. The Bulls performed admirably. At that point, I had to slow the passage of time to near normal speed and personally direct the division-level tactics of the heavy combat mechs, plugging breaches and reinforcing weak points wherever they formed. Counterattacks were out of the question. We couldn't afford to stray from beneath our orbital umbrella, but the ground we did hold, we clung to with everything we had. And at some point, the Roy ran out of steam. Yes, it had cost us nearly our entire orbital group. What remained of our beachhead, now nearly halved in size, was shielded only by the shattered ruins of two still-breathing fortresses, a barely functioning battleship, and a badly mauled cruiser. That was it. No one else was left out on the surface. 3/4 of the Bulls had fallen. The infantry corps had dwindled to less than a full division, and of the 300 atmospheric fighters and strike craft we started with, only about 20 remained combat-ready. But the Roy were finished, too. Apparently, their notions of strategy and tactics didn't allow them to commit the last of their reserves to battle. They had to know we wouldn't just leave things as they were, that a counterstrike on temp. 112 was more than likely. I glanced at the chronometer. It had been 5 days since the assault began. I accelerated the simulation again, and on the 8th day of our desperate holdout, the scanners aboard the least damaged fortress picked up ships emerging from hyperspace. The 5th Strike Fleet under Admiral Nelson. The tactical projection flickered out. In its place, a large message appeared. Time expired. Training scenario terminated. I looked at my watch. I had spent 3.5 hours inside the simulator, more time than General Swirsky had allotted for the exercise. I opened the hatch and stepped out into the hall. All my squadmates were already seated in front of the projection screen, listening intently as the general offered commentary on the performance of another officer. I quietly took a seat in the back row and tried to catch up on what was being said. "Major Linden," Swirsky said, his voice tinged with displeasure, addressing the officer at the screen, my double-chinned acquaintance from the day before. "Your combat effectiveness was below 45%. Do you understand where you went wrong?" "Not yet, General Colonel," Linden replied, with a casual shrug that, in my view, was completely out of line given the vast difference in their ranks. To my surprise, the general ignored the gesture entirely, as if it hadn't happened. "You launched a counterattack against enemy landing forces at a time when it was absolutely the wrong decision, Major," Swirsky explained patiently. "You had no air cover for your Bulls, and you failed to conduct proper reconnaissance of enemy strength. As a result, you lost 90% of your heavy mechs, and your troops suffered heavy casualties. achieving only a minor tactical success while inflicting no proportional damage on the enemy. Is that clear, Major Lyndon? Yes, General Colonel. Lyndon replied, wearing a sour expression. It was clear that he wasn't interested in what the general had to say. Who was this guy, anyway, that he could behave so casually with a superior officer and not fear the consequences? Take your seat, Major. Let's move on to our next commander, the general said with a hint of sarcasm as he turned his gaze toward me. Ah, I see we're now all present. You took your time, Junior Lieutenant. Perhaps you should have made better use of accelerated time mode. Yes, sir, General Colonel. I barked, springing to my feet. At ease, Junior Lieutenant, the general said with a wry smile. This is the General Staff Academy, not a drill square. You're just another student here, same as the rest of these officers. Is that clear? Yes, sir, General Colonel. I replied, now with more ease. Permission to explain the reason for my delay? Not necessary, Lieutenant. We'll see for ourselves in a moment, the general said, tapping something on his tablet. The screen lit up with a tactical projection showing the initial phase of the battle. The general accelerated the playback, and the icons on the map began to move. As he traced the redeployment of the fortresses and the forces, his brow furrowed. Abruptly, he halted the simulation. What am I looking at, Junior Lieutenant? What the hell did you do? I redeployed our forces to a fortified beachhead and established a solid orbital defense umbrella over it. I also evacuated part of the civilian population to the center of that beachhead. I can see that without your commentary. General Swirsky snapped, clearly irritated. Do you understand that this isn't a game, Lieutenant? Do you even realize what you've done? You stripped the planet's defenses and abandoned civilians, people we swore to protect with every resource we had. Do you grasp that? Yes, sir, General Colonel. That's exactly why I did what I did. Explain yourself. Given the current balance of power, it is mathematically impossible to defend the entire planet. All projections confirm this. We can make a heroic last stand, as proven by the gallant death of Lieutenant General Sanders, but we cannot protect both the planet and all its people. I had two objectives. First, to save as many civilians as possible by evacuating them to the beachhead. Second, to deny the ROI the luxury of orbital bombardment and force them into a ground assault under unfavorable conditions. I'm going to resume the playback now, Lieutenant, the general said in a voice like ice. And if what I see fails to convince me, I'll have to reconsider whether you're fit to remain a student at this academy. The image came to life again. The ROI, having landed unopposed, launched their attack. Occasionally, the general sped up the sequence, but on the whole, we sat through nearly 5 hours of simulated warfare. Outside, night had long fallen. A few officers peeked into the room, but quietly retreated when they saw the grim look on the general's face. Throughout the entire session, Swirsky didn't say a word at last. When the sensors on the battered orbital fortress picked up the arrival of the Fifth Strike Fleet, the simulation halted, its runtime exhausted. Swirsky silently tapped his tablet again, and the display continued, showing us events that never happened in reality. General Colonel Swirsky stared at the screen, fists clenched tight. His jaw worked as if he were grinding his teeth, and his eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. We wasted our chance, gentlemen, the general said at last, his voice heavy with bitterness. On the screen, icons representing ROI ships winked out one by one under Admiral Nelson's relentless fire. Dropships began their descent to the beleaguered beachhead, still held by the forces of Lieutenant General Sanders. Forces that, tragically, existed only in simulation. In reality, the general and his entire corps had perished, class dismissed. You're all free to go. It was as if someone had pulled the steel rod from General Swirsky's spine, the one that held up his composure and authority. He sank heavily into the chair behind his desk. Junior Lieutenant Briggs, stay behind. Once the last officer left and the door closed quietly behind him, the general exhaled and said, almost wearily, Lieutenant, I'll have to forward the file from your simulation to the General Staff's Analysis Center. This is too important to overlook. You achieved an off-the-charts level of combat effectiveness for a training scenario, but the method you used borders on criminal. Temp, for maybe a small and sparsely populated planet, but you handed it to the ROI without a fight. along with 40 million Federation citizens. From what I understand, only about 1 million civilians were successfully evacuated to your beachhead by the local administration. Sir, with respect, was saving 1 million lives worse than losing the entire population? Not worse, Lieutenant. In fact, given the scenario's parameters, I'd say the Roy wouldn't have had time to carry out a full-scale genocide. I believe that, had this been a real engagement, at least half the planet's population could have survived. But that's not the point. Those are numbers. And then there are things like military honor. We do not abandon civilians to the enemy. Ever. Even if it means the army takes devastating and seemingly senseless losses. I understood where the general was coming from. He was a man of the old guard, forged before the war with the Roy began. He remembered peace, and his sense of duty, of what it meant to be an officer, came from that world. 20 years of war hadn't changed it in the slightest. General Colonel, this war isn't about losing territory or halting expansion, I said, looking him straight in the eyes. It's about whether humanity survives as a species or the Roy become the only intelligence left in the galaxy. There are no more civilians, no more soldiers. Those lines died with the last failed peace talks. We're all soldiers now. Even the children, even the elderly, though not all of them realize it yet. There's no more room for abstract humanitarian ideals. All that matters is combat effectiveness. And that alone must be the guiding principle of every officer, at least until this war ends in our victory. You saw it yourself, sir. In that simulation, my cold calculus and ruthless tactics turned out to be the most humane solution available. Swirsky was silent for a long moment. Maybe my principles are outdated, Lieutenant. I can accept that possibility. I can see now that if all 3 planetary commanders had used your strategy, we could have held the system and saved a majority of the population. I understand your reasoning, and I might even agree that there's no other way to fight this war. He exhaled slowly. But I still can't bring myself to accept it. My sense of honor as an officer won't allow it. And I'm sure many of my colleagues at the General Staff would feel the same. I agree with much of your assessment, General Colonel, I said, my voice steady. But my goal is clear, to win this war. Everything else I'm ready to put on a shelf in the farthest corner of my mind. In a real battle, I would have acted exactly as I did in this exercise. After the victory, my conscience will bring all the deferred bills. Then I'll be able to evaluate my actions in terms of ethics and honor. But not before. And if anyone asks me what is more certain to lead humanity to victory, humanitarianism or the firepower density of my troops, I would unhesitatingly choose the latter. Where did you gain your high command experience, Junior Lieutenant? Swirsky changed the subject abruptly. Thus, 3, Sir, General Colonel. Command of a heavy assault brigade. A junior lieutenant, brigade commander? At that time, I was still a cadet at the Planetary Assault Academy. There simply were no other candidates for the position. The Golden Star from there. 2. Correct, Sir, General Colonel. Now it's clear why you made such confident decisions during the exercise. You're a good officer, Junior Lieutenant. A real warrior focused on victory. In the accompanying letter for the training exercise materials I'll send to the General Staff, I'll provide a positive evaluation of your actions, even though I don't fully share your perspective. It's a pity that fewer and fewer students, like you, are entering our academy, while more and more untouchable incompetents, like Major Linden, who should never be allowed anywhere near command, are getting through. Yet behind him stands a military-industrial lobby. May I ask a question, Sir, General Colonel? Go ahead. Is Major Linden really untouchable? What happens to someone who goes against him? From the look on the general's face, I could tell that he already regretted bringing up Linden and his backers. This wasn't the kind of conversation you should be having with a junior lieutenant, but it seemed the general was still under the shock of realizing that a large and critical strategic operation could have been won, but the chance had been missed. Why do you ask, Junior Lieutenant? The general suddenly switched to using the informal you in a way that caught me off guard. Yesterday, at the formal dinner, I had an unpleasant conversation with Major Linden and his friends. They tried to aggressively extract from me who had pushed me into the academy. I admitted, not hiding the truth. I didn't engage with them. That's noble, but foolish, the general smirked. Now expect trouble. Our academy gets regular visits from ministry commissions, who love poking their noses into all sorts of interesting details of the lives of cadets and faculty. They take a particularly close interest in some successes and failures. Those behind Linden will certainly tip off these military officials on what, and whom, they should pay the most attention to. Perhaps they've taken you for a future lobbyist for the competition. So get ready, Junior Lieutenant, to answer some uncomfortable questions. Though not often, weekends at the academy did happen, and on those days, I would head to Titan to deal with the accumulating matters of the Briggs Arms Company and to meet with Inga, who had finally returned from her practical training. As I had expected, she refused to leave the active military, but I had to try, at least. Jeff and Stein didn't leave the academy's repair zone, and it was starting to pay off. The professor, looking 10 years younger, was radiating energy. This was what a real, meaningful job and a goal, with a capital G, did to a person. Lieutenant Jeff was in his element and thoroughly enjoying the process, which was occasionally interrupted only by Cadet Yakovleva, the spelunker girl, a distant acquaintance of Inga's, the same one I had stood with in the academy head's office during the entrance exams. Due to significant losses among the first-year cadets, General Schiller had ordered an additional intake, and candidate Yakovleva didn't miss her chance. Just as she didn't miss her chance with Lieutenant Jeff, by mid-August, my tired but satisfied team reported the completion of all the work. For our internal acceptance of the new technology samples, I invited General Schiller. Why wouldn't I, if we were going to conduct our trials on the Academy's test range? The general didn't miss the chance to drill the cadets again, setting up the trials as a training battle that a company of third-year cadets was simulating the defense of an important military facility on an attacked planet. My squad's task was to capture it with minimal damage. For maximum realism, we purchased the latest models of combat scanners from the CWC, Chinese Weapons Corporation, and equipped the scalpel units of the guard company with them. General Schiller comfortably settled in the observation bunker at the test range, along with Jeff and the professor, while I led my former training squad into battle. Actually, it was Inga who commanded the squad, and I was just playing the role of a consultant and representative of the developers. The battle itself didn't really happen. In each of our 3 landing bots, we installed 6 of our own specially designed EW stations, which were integrated at the construction level to work together. To optimize their settings, I specifically purchased one of the most powerful computers, the kind that even the Lunar Colonial Tech Corporation would envy, not to mention any of the capital city's universities. This marvel of technology cost $18 million, but I didn't regret it. The result more than justified the expense. When we activated our camouflage for the first time, a ringing silence hung in the repair zone hangar for about 10 seconds, until someone from the tech team, astonished, broke the silence with a "no way." Of course, the bot didn't become invisible, but even from 10 meters away, it noticeably faded and slightly blurred, losing sharpness in its contours. Standard scanners, on the other hand, would only start detecting it at a distance of 2 to 3 kilometers, which was usually too late to take any action. A similar upgrade was applied to the scalpel units, each receiving 2 EW stations. The armored suits required quite a bit of work, but the experience I had gained from creating my equipment for the Proxima training helped us handle it in a reasonable time. Of course, our hypothetical enemy was careful not to make any foolish mistakes. They set up a network of external scanners around the protected facility and created some sort of security perimeter. Additionally, one of the 3 platoons constantly patrolled the surrounding area, both on foot and with the help of drones. In general, the third-year cadets adhered fully to the proper security protocols. The only problem was that their measures were completely inadequate against our new camouflage systems. We detected the enemy's scanners significantly earlier than they even began to react to our equipment. The bots dropped their troops 3 kilometers from the patrolled zone, and Inga's platoon began to move forward at a leisurely pace, slipping between the external observation posts and hiding in the folds of the terrain from the drones. It's convenient to fight when you detect the enemy at a distance many hundreds of meters beyond the range at which they can detect you. That we concentrated on our starting position, and Inga gave the order for the bots to begin the attack. The machines, flying just above the ground with slightly blurred silhouettes, reached the rocket launch point undetected. A rocket salvo under test range conditions against targets that don't even see you is a simple task. It becomes especially grim for the defenders when they realize that their air defense systems can't even properly lock onto the enemy vehicles after the salvo. It ended very quickly. 95% of the enemy infantry and equipment were marked as destroyed or disabled by the range's computer after a rocket strike, and they stood frozen, like statues, with their energy systems shut down. The surviving scalpel and a dozen infantrymen couldn't do anything against a full assault platoon that literally appeared out of nowhere. I have to give credit to the third-year cadets. We took some losses too. The computer recorded 3 enemy kills during the defense. A pretty good result given such a hopeless scenario. General Schiller invited us to his office. Jeff, the professor, and I comfortably sat at the table opposite the academy's commander. The general smiled. It had been a while since I'd seen him in such a good mood. "Gentlemen, I sincerely congratulate you," began Schiller. "You've created something truly impressive. If the Ministry of Defense Commission doesn't adopt it, I'll personally send this recording of the training battle, with my commentary, to all my former colleagues now holding high positions. I want my graduates to fight in these machines, and I'll make that happen." "Thank you, General Lieutenant," I replied, pleased to hear those words from an old soldier, but my smile was a bit sad. "I'm afraid your help might indeed be needed, and quite soon." We didn't wait for the Ministry of Defense Commission to come to us on its own initiative. We submitted an application to conduct demonstration trials of our new weaponry. We had to wait almost a week for a response from the ministry. As the ministry officials explained, the process of coordinating the testing program and the composition of the commission was underway. Finally, the military bureaucrats informed us that we were expected to arrive on the 5th of September with our personnel and equipment on Oberon, the moon of Uranus, where the specialized testing range of the Ministry of Defense's new weaponry commission was located. At one point, Russia had tried to explore the moon of Uranus, but either they didn't have the resources or simply didn't want to, and the terraforming was never completed. As a result, the moon has a weak sun, hanging motionless above the main city of the colony, and a similarly weak gravity corrector, whose effect didn't extend across the entire moon. As a result, the habitable zone for humans covered less than a fifth of the moon's surface. Closer to the boundaries of the habitable area, conditions became downright miserable, and almost no one lived there. However, enormous automated factories and the vast Ministry of Defense testing range thrived in those regions that I was puzzled by the composition of the commission. The chairman turned out to be General Barrington, who was not particularly famous for his combat achievements, but was known for his ability to organize rear services, transportation logistics, and supply for the troops during the chaos of the war with Roy. This ability somewhat compensated for the glaring weakness of Earth's combat forces compared to the Roy forces invading the human-explored space. In short, he was a respected military expert from every angle. But the commission members representing, as I understood, the military-industrial complex raised many questions. Despite their high ranks, neither Jeff nor I had ever heard of them before, and there was no clear information about them on the network either. Their qualification chevrons barely met the minimum requirements for combat experience, and something told me they had inflated their credentials by all possible means. Nevertheless, we had no choice but to hope that Chairman Barrington's leadership would bring some objectivity to the Commission's conclusions. The only issue was that the aging general, who had started the war already an older man, had significantly deteriorated by now, and it was hard to say how he would behave under pressure from the other Commission members, compared to the training battle set up by General Schiller. The work of the Ministry of Defense's commission looked much more academic. First, the landing bots, scalpel units, and infantry in battle suits were scanned from various distances, both stationary and in motion, simply moving and firing their standard weapons. All the results were carefully documented, and only after that did they move on to testing in conditions closer to combat. Since we had specified in our application that our ECM stations not only reduced the visibility of the landing bots, robots, and soldiers in combat suits, but also enabled a new landing tactic. This part of the testing program was expanded into 2 stages. First, we simulated a standard landing operation where the bots enter the atmosphere, approach the landing point, cover it with thermobaric missiles, land, and deploy the troops. Naturally, During this process, the surface scanned us, and when the landing was detected, the bots were hit with simulated light surface-to-air missiles. According to the trial scenario, after the suppression of the enemy's heavy air defense systems via orbital strike, the enemy managed to redeploy 2 platoons of light robots of the small snake type to the landing point. By the way, this was a fairly realistic scenario. When General Barrington announced these conditions and asked if we had any questions, I took the floor. General, before presenting our development to the Ministry of Defense's commission, we conducted comprehensive in-house tests on our new equipment, and I can confidently say that the conditions proposed by the commission will not allow us to fully demonstrate its capabilities. I request that the conditions be made more challenging by modifying the scenario as follows. The orbital strike only partially reached its target. A functional stationary scanner and 1 heavy ground-to-air missile battery remain in the landing zone. Additionally, the enemy was able to deploy a full company of small serpents to the threatened area. The general let out a thoughtful grunt. Well, Mr. Briggs, the general now spoke to me not as a junior lieutenant, but as the director of the Briggs Arms Company. You proposed this yourself, so there's no backing out now. We'll need about 30 minutes to reconfigure the range. Get ready that we descended into Oberon's thin atmosphere from a low orbit. Our bot, piloted by Inga and me, was the first to go. The general was a little surprised at my desire to personally participate in the trials, but he didn't object. We activated our ECM stations right away, as there was no need to save energy. We didn't have to worry about being detected by the stationary scanner at the standard detection range for a regular landing bot. This wasn't a training ground, and no instructor would pull any dirty tricks at 30 kilometers above the surface. The bot's computer warned us with a tone about the high intensity of the radiation from the stationary scanner. For a standard bot, this would mean an 80% chance of detection. However, we hadn't been spotted yet. After descending another 10 kilometers, Inga ordered the bots to release the ECM missile pods. 6 low-speed missiles began to circle around the trio of bots, further masking them from detection. We couldn't see anything on the ground yet either. It's much easier to hide ground targets than airborne ones at 15 kilometers. Inga launched disposable reconnaissance drones that sped ahead to scout the landing site. 10 seconds later, the ground targets lit up in red on our tactical projections. Finally, we were detected. The stationary scanner was quite persistent. At that moment, all 3 of our bots launched salvos of mock thermobaric rockets, while simultaneously releasing 2 decoys, which immediately began to simulate landing bots. The heavy ground-to-air missile battery did not fire. Its targeting system couldn't lock onto the escaping signals from the enemy machines, but 6 distinct marks created by our decoys appeared on the scanners, and the computer gave the order to fire. 12 missiles launched from their rails and shot into the sky. Almost simultaneously, 10 small serpents fired, launching 20 additional light missiles at the targets. The transport reloading vehicles rolled up to the robots and began supplying them with new munitions, but by this time, our salvo had reached the surface. 120 unguided thermobaric rockets left the enemy with little chance. Only the armored dome of the stationary air defense point and a couple of small serpents, located on the edge of the landing zone, survived. The decoys predictably were destroyed by hits from the heavy missiles. Naturally, there were no real explosions. We only saw bright flashes since the warheads were equipped with training charges. However, the range computer marked the decoys as destroyed targets. There were still many missiles heading toward us. Having lost sight of clear targets, they continued flying in our direction, and their not-so-intelligent electronic brains had no choice but to order the detonation of the warheads in the area where we might be. Basically, it was a shot in the dark, but they got lucky. The second section's bot was hit by simulated strike elements from the warhead of a heavy missile that detonated. Fortunately, the explosion occurred about 100 meters from the bot, or else we would have lost a third of the platoon. Bot 2 has sustained damage. The synthetic voice of the range computer announced in our cabin. Engine power reduced by 30%. Both thermobaric rocket launchers and the aircraft gun are out of order at this point. It didn't matter. The platoon was preparing to land. In response to the weak and inaccurate fire from the surviving small serpents, the bot's aircraft guns launched a coordinated salvo. and then the entire platoon charged up the lowered ramps into the attack. This time, we avoided casualties. Inga had taken into account the lessons from the previous tests, and we methodically suppressed the enemy from a distance with our scalpel drones. We captured the stationary air defense battery without a fight. There was no one left to defend it. The second stage of the range test followed our scenario. With the same initial conditions, we chose a completely different tactic, the one we had demonstrated to General Schiller. The bots deployed the landing force outside the stationary scanner's range, and the platoon struck from the ground at the same time the bots launched their missile salvo. The enemy didn't even have time to return fire. A few aimless shots in our direction didn't count. We captured the air defense battery while its missiles were still on the rails. It had no one to shoot at. The stationary scanner only managed to detect the bots at the moment the thermobaric rockets were launched, but the battery's guidance system couldn't lock onto the targets. When we returned to the range's operations hall, General Barrington greeted us with a pleased smile, while the faces of his aides were decidedly soured. "Congratulations, Mr. Briggs," the general said, extending his hand to me. "To me, a junior lieutenant. You did an excellent job with a more difficult task. I was wrong to doubt you. I believe your development will be adopted for use in the shortest possible time. We urgently need these machines, yesterday even. What do you think, gentlemen?" He turned to his entourage, a short, balding man with a slippery expression, and Lieutenant General epaulets spoke up. "The result is certainly impressive, but before making a decision about accepting these samples for service, we need to consider not only the technical specifications of the machines and equipment presented to us. Price, production resource consumption, and the ability of the technology to withstand the harsh conditions of combat operations also play a significant role. The price promised by the Briggs Arms Company for the production models exceeds the current price by almost 40%. That's a lot, but they're 2 heads above the standard machines," General Barrington exclaimed, clearly outraged. "Where before we needed a full company, now 1 platoon can handle it. This more than justifies the price increase and resource consumption. Perhaps, Mr. General," the second lieutenant general interjected, "but there's still the matter of reliability and resistance to breakdowns under combat conditions. This point must be clarified for sure. In my opinion, to make a final decision, we need combat trials." "Exactly, Mr. General," confirmed the second member of the commission. "We can't adopt unfinished machines into service." "Well, gentlemen," Barrington said, sounding uncertain, "if you're all so unanimous, we'll schedule combat trials. Any suggestions for the location?" "Temp. 112, Mr. General," the balding general immediately responded. "A few days ago, our unmanned scout intercepted a signal from one of the large peripheral asteroids. The system was recently captured by the enemy, and there are still surviving settlements on its outskirts. In this case, it's our scientific station, which was conducting important research. So important that the general staff is concerned about its rescue. The thing is, only light scouts can get close, but the Roy has already landed on the asteroid. Not many, but it's too much for the scouts. And the Briggs Arms Company positions camouflage as the main advantage of its combat machines. It's perfect for this. We need to conduct a landing, clear the entrance to an underground lab, and evacuate the personnel. There are only 15 people. They'll fit easily into the landing bots. Isn't that a bit too much for combat trials?" Barrington said with doubt. "This operation is for well-trained special forces. Just right, Mr. General," the other general commander replied. "Especially if the Briggs Arms Company can prepare 2 or 3 more bots. Then we'll definitely have enough force that I really wanted to smash something over that scoundrel's head, but I stood there with an impassive face, waiting for the chairman's decision that he pondered for a minute, then turned to me and asked, "Mr. Briggs, you entrusted the control of your machines during state trials to a platoon of cadets from the Planetary Assault Academy. You have that much confidence in them?" "I fought alongside these men on Protus 3, Mr. General. If they didn't let me down there, I understand. Will they be going on the combat trials too? If it's authorized by Academy Commandant General Lieutenant Schillard, I have no doubt about his decision." Barrington smiled. "Who would you like to see in command of the operation?" "Myself, Mr. General. Is that so?" The general raised an eyebrow. "First time I've seen a head of an arms company willing to personally lead the combat trials of their own tech." "Well then, in that case, I expect your operation plan by this evening. All expenses for its preparation, including the purchase of necessary equipment and ammunition, will be covered by the Ministry of Defense. Both lieutenant generals simultaneously grimaced. No matter, don't fall apart, gentlemen. Now I'll have enough funds to prepare a couple more bots, maybe even 3. By General Barrington's order, we were provided not only the funding, but also a brigade of skilled engineers and technicians. Time was of the essence. The Roy could discover the scientists hiding in the underground lab at any moment. But we also couldn't rush in with insufficient forces. General Lieutenant Schiller was grinding his teeth and swearing heavily. He'd already lost enough cadets, and this operation promised even more casualties, but the thought of refusing me never even crossed his mind. On the contrary, he was doing everything he could to help us. In addition to my former platoon, I took Stephen Fulton's platoon with me on the operation. He'd already been discharged from the hospital and returned to the academy. After Protus 3, our relationship had finally normalized, and the operation and his serious injury had changed Stephen as well. I also reached out to General Barrington to request the assignment of Captain Marcus Doyle and 5 to 7 of his people to my command. I had a strong suspicion that we would need the services of professional scouts. But how will you handle the chain of command, Mr. Briggs? The general asked, slightly surprised. You're just a second lieutenant, but Captain Doyle. The general paused, glancing at his tablet. No, not a captain, but Major Doyle. To put it mildly, he outranks you. We'll work it out. Mr. General, I replied. Major Doyle has fought under my command before, though back then he was a captain and I was just a cadet. But that doesn't change anything. You have quite the colorful biography, Mr. Briggs, the general chuckled. I'll find out where Major Doyle is now and try to arrange everything. Despite all the assistance and constant motivational pushes from above, we were only able to leave for the temp system after 3 days. However, the reconnaissance probes, regularly sent to the asteroid area, confirmed that the laboratory had not been discovered by the enemy yet. Nevertheless, the situation could change at any moment, and we still had about 10 days of travel ahead of us that we arrived at a remote point. In space, just one jump away from temp, on a medium-sized assault transport. There, 3 small ships of the medium reconnaissance class were already waiting for us, equipped with the most advanced cloaking systems, as Barrington assured us, currently available to the Earth Federation. I regretted not having had the chance to work with their EW systems before the operation, but it was too late to think about that now, and besides, no one would have given me that opportunity anyway. According to the approved plan, we were supposed to load 2 landing bots into each of the reconnaissance ships. This operation turned out to be quite complicated because reconnaissance ships were never designed for troop transport. Formally, the internal volume of the hold was sufficient, but the complete lack of the necessary infrastructure, such as special clamps and fixators, as well as a launch catapult for deploying the bots into space, created a number of unexpected difficulties that we had to solve on the spot. Marcus Doyle and his team had arrived earlier than us, and we met in the tiny mess of the flagship of our small squadron, throwing Captain 3rd Rank Yun Gao into shock by violating all basic rules of subordination. Yun Gao, who held the same rank as Marcus Doyle, expected a formal report from the arriving lieutenant. However, when I entered the mess, Marcus Doyle jumped up before I even had a chance to speak, and with a pleased smile on his face, he said, Lieutenant, Major Doyle, with 7 scouts from the reconnaissance company of the 3rd Battalion, 105th Infantry Division, has arrived at your disposal. Honestly, I didn't expect that, but I tried to get out of the awkward situation without completely throwing Yun Gao into a state of confusion. Good to see you again, Major, I replied, saluting and shaking Marcus Doyle's hand. And turning to the ship's commander, I continued, Captain 3rd Rank. Lieutenant Nathan Briggs has arrived with 2 platoons of assault troops for a joint rescue operation. Yun, Marcus Doyle said with difficulty suppressing laughter. Sorry, I didn't inform you immediately. I'm only in command of my people here. The leadership of the operation is assigned to Lieutenant. You could have told me right away. The Chinese officer recovered, throwing a fierce glance at Marcus Doyle. I didn't expect a circus from Guizhou. Nice to meet you, Lieutenant. Make yourself at home. We'll discuss the details of your transport to the location and the procedure for the landing. The asteroid that was our target was quite a large planetoid. It didn't have its own atmosphere, but it was large enough to form almost a perfect sphere. This mass of ice and stone had formed on the outer edges of the Temp star system during the planet formation era and had remained an unformed planet, unable to clear its orbit of the boulders and debris that made up the local version of the Kuiper belt. The reconnaissance ships didn't risk entering the system deeply. With each passing day, the Hive increased the density of their network of watchtowers and patrols, and Captain Gao deemed a direct approach to the target too dangerous. Considering the Hive had surprised us with their new cloaking technology during the Temp assault, I couldn't disagree with him. If the enemy had improved their stealth systems, they may have also advanced in their scanning systems, so none of us were willing to take unnecessary risks at 10 million kilometers from the target. The external hatches of the hold opened, and the improvised pneumatic catapults gently ejected the landing bots into open space. After waiting for a minute to ensure the bots had moved to a safe distance from the ships, Captain Gao ordered a cautious deceleration and course change. The ships would need to turn in a wide arc and leave the system, only to return in 3 days to the designated rendezvous point to pick up the bots. Good luck, assault team. Came the short message over the laser optical channel, and the communication was cut off. The ships disappeared among the distant stars, and our machines continued their flight toward the target by inertia. We still had nearly 28 hours of travel ahead of us to reach the asteroid's surface. I figured it was better to endure the monotony in the poorly adapted landing bots under the reliable cover of our new EW stations than to approach the target in more comfortable ships. With uncertain results 0.7 hours later, our scanners detected a scrambled pulse signal from the asteroid. The scientists confirmed that everything was fine on their end. Of course, we had precise information about the location of the laboratory and a detailed map of the surrounding area, but our data on the Hive forces was only approximate. Intelligence estimated that there was no more than a standard infantry company on the asteroid in preparation for the operation. We had to replace nearly all our ammunition and recalibrate part of our equipment. The landing on the asteroid, which had no atmosphere and weak gravity, was no simple task. For instance, thermobaric warheads, typically used on landing bots, wouldn't work in these conditions. They required an atmosphere rich in oxygen. Moving across the surface in low gravity also created challenges for the unaccustomed human body. We, of course, trained in such conditions, but it wasn't something we had done much. However, low gravity had one significant advantage, which we planned to exploit. Landing bots cannot launch from planets and are usually returned to orbit by special transports. But that wasn't the case here. The asteroid's gravity, negligible compared to a planet's, didn't pose a problem for the bot's engines. We could leave for open space on our own, without the help of ships. While we were slowly approaching our target, I had plenty of time to think and even scold myself for not having paid attention to upgrading the scanners. I was eager to see the enemy positions as soon as possible, but upon further reflection, I realized that we simply didn't have the resources or the time for such a distraction. So now I had no choice but to rely on our advanced cloaking systems that a long-known immutable law of misfortune states. If something can go wrong, it will. A specific instance of this law is the butterfly law, where a piece of buttered bread always falls butter side down. Below, on the surface of the asteroid, we encountered another specific instance of the aforementioned law. Hive soldiers were milling about right next to the entrance to the laboratory, and there were a lot of them. Senior Sergeant Fulton, I called for the commander of the 2nd Squad. On the line, Commander, allocate 2 bots for a diversionary maneuver. The 3rd section will be placed under my command. Accept the landing coordinates. Your task is to draw the enemy forces towards you and keep them engaged for 30 minutes. Do not engage in close combat. Use the advantages of our EW systems and stay at the maximum effective range. Is the task clear? Roger that. Commander, 30 minutes after landing, break off from the enemy, load into the bots, and head into open space. Proceed to the rendezvous point on your own. Understood. Permission to proceed? Proceed. Good luck, Stephen. Thank you, Commander. 1st Squad and 3rd section of the 2nd Squad, begin deceleration. Fulton must start the attack. About 10 minutes before we do. Inga and Calm, 3 of the 2nd Squad confirmed receipt of the order, and I shifted all my attention to the tactical projection. Right now, the bots of Fulton's two sections had moved ahead and adjusted their course slightly. I had tasked them with making a noise about 200 kilometers from the laboratory, but I wasn't sure if this would draw all the Hive soldiers to them. Below, on the asteroid's surface, enemy units from a full infantry battalion, reinforced with two heavy robots, probably Titans, were moving about, both in groups and scattered. Also, at a distance from the main forces, there was a landing transport on the ground, which had likely brought the entire group here. I pondered. If the diversionary maneuver didn't pull enough Hive forces away from the entrance to the laboratory, the mission would be extremely difficult. The scientists in the bunker already knew about us. Transmission via laser optical channels was almost impossible to intercept or jam, but it required the receiver to be in direct line of sight, and its location had to be precisely known. We knew the location, so the lab's inhabitants, dressed in civilian spacesuits, were already waiting for our team to extract them. Unfortunately, their suits were civilian grade, without armor or weapons, incapable of withstanding even light, weapon fire or shrapnel, so I would need to find a way to give them a few safe minutes at the entrance to the laboratory for the scientists to board the bot. Only a few minutes remained before the active phase of the operation began. A decision had to be made right now. Third sections of the first and second squads change course. Your task is to attack the enemy landing transport with unguided rockets from a distance of 30 kilometers, followed by a landing and demonstrative fire toward the enemy. Don't get close. Just make the attack known and immediately fall back into the bots and head into space. Proceed to the rendezvous point on your own. The group will be led by Cadet Justwinderd. Understood. The section commanders replied in unison. The attack on the Hive transport would undoubtedly provoke a strong response. There was a high probability that the battalion command post was on board, and for a Hive soldier, their commanding officer was almost a god. We could only hope that a simultaneous attack on 2 points would force the enemy to reveal what they had considered a safe area. Fulton went first. His rocket salvo was as precise as a training exercise, hitting the targets perfectly while remaining undetected by the enemy. However, the Hive soldiers turned out to be experienced, and the element of surprise lasted no more than 20 seconds after the enemy platoon's ranks erupted in fountains of explosions from fragmentation-fused warheads. The return salvo was slow and inaccurate, which was to be expected given their inability to properly lock onto the targets with their fire control systems. But the fact that they returned fire so quickly wasn't reassuring. What does an experienced soldier do when they realize their fire can't reach an enemy equipped with longer-range weapons or just well camouflaged? They either retreat, hide, and call for reinforcements or artillery fire, or they rush forward, closing the distance and engaging in close combat. The Hive soldiers never liked retreating, but they didn't forget to call for reinforcements. The platoon, thinned out after the rocket strike, moved toward Fulton's position. Stephen didn't try to be a hero, strictly following the orders. He pulled back while maintaining distance, showering the enemy with anti-tank rockets from his scalpel bots. Despite the clearly high skill of the Little Serpent's pilots, all 3 of the enemy's robots were motionless within minutes, frozen among the rocks and ice chunks. The enemy infantry, unable to pursue the heavily armed adversary without support, hesitated, but no less than a company of Hive soldiers and 2 heavy robots were rushing toward the battlefield. The low gravity allowed them to move very quickly, making giant leaps across the surface. I once again noted with concern the enemy's high level of training. It was clear this battalion knew how to fight in such conditions. I no longer had direct communication with Fulton, so I couldn't help him or warn him of the danger. All I could do was hope for the combat skills of my former foe. The attack on the Hive transport began with a rocket salvo. 80 fragmentation-fused warheads landed close or exploded directly on the enemy ship's hull. Of course, they couldn't penetrate the armor. I wasn't even sure that, had the warheads been shaped charges, we would have been successful. After all, ship armor is designed for space combat, where entirely different calibers are used. Nevertheless, the ship was completely unprepared for such a turn of events. Its main cargo hold was open, the landing ramp was lowered to the ground, and my cadets had the presence of mind to launch the attack from the right side. As a result, several rockets flew into the ship and exploded inside. They still couldn't inflict fatal damage on the transport, but the mere fact of the attack and the unexpected losses sent the enemy into a frenzy. The Titans, which had been charging toward Fulton's platoon in giant leaps, abruptly changed direction to nearly the opposite and rushed to eliminate the new threat. All the enemy forces that had not yet been engaged in the battle sprang into action and began converging on the transport. A few minutes later, when fighting flared near the enemy ship, I gave the order to initiate the rescue operation. Roy offered no resistance to our landing. At this point, they had much more pressing matters at hand. I was very concerned about the squads that had attacked the ship. Enemy forces were rushing toward them, and it would be very difficult for my people to break free from this pressure. A head-on confrontation, given the balance of power, would be impossible for my people to withstand. Nevertheless, I had a specific mission before me, and I focused on completing it. 2 squads from the 1st platoon swiftly formed a defensive perimeter around the entrance to the laboratory. Major Doyle, I need a temporary electronic perimeter, external scanners at the heights, and drones over the landing zone. Understood. Commander, the hatch disguised as a piece of rock trembled and slid aside. Through the narrow gap, people in civilian space suits began to emerge. Bent under the weight of bulky cases, they sprinted toward the nearest bot, accompanied by armored Marines. Either Roy had finally figured out that the attack was being carried out with such a small force that it could only be a diversion, or their scanners detected the opening of the entrance to the shelter and the people in civilian spacesuits, who were not equipped with any camouflaging equipment. Either way, a worried voice from Inga crackled in my helmet. Commander, both Titans are heading this way, along with 4 little serpents and a platoon of enemy infantry. They haven't spotted us yet. I'm detecting a missile launch. Everyone, quickly move away from the bunker. We have no more than 15 seconds. Bots, immediate liftoff. I shouted over the command frequency and pushed the engines of my machine into afterburner. Thankfully, the scientists were already on board. If Roy had realized what was happening 30 seconds earlier, we would have had some serious problems, though even now I wouldn't say they weren't serious. The Titans launched their rockets from 50 kilometers away. They targeted large areas. They didn't spot our landing force, but by opening the entrance, the laboratory had revealed itself, and now Roy had a clearly visible target. We almost made it. The heavy assault Titan robot was a terrifying weapon. I had personally confirmed this while sitting in its cockpit and firing at Roy on Protus 3. Now, I was on the other side of the crosshairs. According to the plan, we were supposed to blow up the laboratory before leaving the asteroid. I think that now there was no need for that. The surface of the planetoid in the strike zone erupted in massive columns of stone and ice debris, soaring to impossible heights thanks to the low gravity. We were hit by the edge of this man-made eruption. Had there been an atmosphere here, the shockwave would have caused significant damage. But even so, parts of the platoon were caught in a hail of shrapnel and explosive fragments. On the tactical projection, red flames marked the loss of telemetry from 5 Marine space suits and 1 scalpel bot. The bot from the 2nd squad sustained damage, and its camouflage system faltered momentarily, but it quickly began to recover, coming closer to normal with each passing second. The bot's computer used our latest software algorithm and gradually adjusted the settings of the ECM stations, taking into account the changes caused by the damage it had sustained. I realized that we wouldn't be allowed to calmly board the bots and leave. We had to deal with the Titans, or in a few minutes, they would turn us to dust. Inga, slowly withdraw the platoon here. I pointed to the gathering point on the tactical projection. Bot 2, do as I say. Roger. The pilot of the 2nd machine immediately responded that we flew in a large arc, skimming the surface and using our electronic warfare systems at full power to shield us from the Titans and Serpent scanners. Fulton was still fighting. According to orders, he needed to hold out for another 10 minutes. I was deeply concerned about the ongoing battle near Roy's transport. One of the surviving drones, stationed slightly away from our landing zone, was detecting flashes of gunfire and explosions in that direction. A few minutes later, we got behind Roy, who was eagerly pursuing the 1st platoon. Inga was almost at the gathering point I had indicated. The targeting and navigation system of the bot locked onto the enemy's heavy robots and reported readiness to fire. 2nd, ready for launch? I checked with my wingman. Ready. Fire.